Ready? Welcome everyone to the March 9th Eugene City Council work session. Thank you everybody who's here and those listening at home. We have two councilors who are not here because they are at the League of Cities meeting, and the rest of us are here and ready to go to work. So Councilor Surratt has a motion she wants to put on the table for your consideration.
So thank you, Mayor. And I sent this out ahead of time along with the draft resolution, and if I get a second, I will speak to the motion. I move that the City Council adopt a resolution supporting the reopening of the Willamette Falls locks.
Second.
Thank you. And seconded.
So this was a request that was sent to Mayor Piercy from the office of Congresswoman Darlene Hooley as part of an effort going on with the National Trust for Historic Preservation to get the state legislature to initiate a study on having the Army Corps of Engineers reopen the Willamette Falls Navigation Canal and Locks, which is located on the Westland side of Willamette Falls. I don't have a lot of personal knowledge about this issue, but it seemed to be a fine thing for us to support. The cities of West Lynn, Oregon City, and Wilsonville have adopted similar resolutions as ours, and there's some detail within the resolution itself speaking to the historic nature of the locks and the impact that was felt by the community when they were closed and rendered non-navigable some time ago. So this is an effort to create a study to look at the viability of reopening those, and I hope this council will support it.
Thank you. Councilor Clark?
Thank you. I often feel this way when we work on Intergovernmental Relations Committee and we consider bills before the legislature for city support or endorsement. And I'm just seeing this part here just now. So is there any source of information that is available at all that can give us a better sense of the impact of this before we vote? I know it's a resolution, so it has no force of law per se.
I'm afraid I don't have access to anyone who could inform us during this work session. The letter from Congresswoman Hooley's office, did come with contact, and we could follow up with them. And George Brown.
Any other?
That's it.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, this is just a resolution to study, to support opening. And I read the resolution, and it calls for a study to see, how much would it cost to do that. And then I imagine the next question is who's going to pay for it on an ongoing basis. And I wish I had examined this earlier, but I see that Eco Northwest did a study last September entitled Willamette Locks Economic Potential Report. And, they have fish ladders. Salmon can get up those falls. I think people should be able to do it again like they used to be able to. And I think it'd be a really good thing. I think we should at least encourage, the legislature to do a much closer look at it. And I believe that that's all this resolution is calling for, and I would definitely support it. I think it's a good idea. Thank you.
Councilor Pryor?
In concept, I'm absolutely supportive of the idea. I think the locks should be reopened so that the one river idea can be pursued, so the entire river is navigable. I think as a concept, it's great. The only hesitation I might have is I don't know what the economic impact would be, and at the other end of the spectrum, I don't know what the economic costs would be. If we're urging something to occur, I would want to do the urging with at least an idea of what the potential costs would be. I realize that part of the state task force would be to study what some of those costs might be, but there may also be an element to that says the Willamette Locks Economic Potential Report. I've not had a chance to look at that, so I don't know. What I don't want to telegraph to the public is that I'm willing to vote on resolutions without enough information to feel comfortable doing it. So if you wanted to pass a resolution that simply supported the creation of a task force which does further study, I'm all for that. But urging the Army Corps to expedite needed rehabilitation without knowing where the source of money would come from or what kind of impact that source of money might have on other kinds of things, gee, I don't know. You know, I could be saying I want to do this, and it may wind up hurting something else. So if we wanted to say, if I were to make an amendment, even if you may accept it as friendly, but if I were to make an amendment to say take out Section 1 because that's a cost, I don't know what that implication might be. Keep Section 2 because the creation of this task force is a great idea. Urges the delegation to support expedited repair. Once again, I don't know what that involves from a cost standpoint. And supports rehabilitation. 4 is okay because that's just supporting rehabilitation, doesn't have a dollar amount attached to it. And then it's effective immediately. So if you took out 1 and you took out 3 only because we don't know what the cost implications for those would be, we might add those later on, but that way we could get something taken care of tonight, which may be something that you're looking for. And I'd be more than happy to support that. It's not because I don't support it in toto, it's just I don't know what the financial implications are.
Councilor Brown?
Thank you, Mayor. Well, I don't think it's really necessary to take those out because they're not going to happen unless number 2 happens. So, and nobody's going to do this unless it's cost effective. So I think that number 1 and 3 are harmless and fine, just left in there, personally. Thank you.
Yes, no.
So, I mean, I guess I'm faced with a couple of options. One would be to see if Councilor Pryor was making a friendly amendment and accept that. 2 would be to table this and request a copy of the Echo Northwest report be sent to councilors, and then we could take it up again after we come back from our break.
Great idea.
You know, my only hesitation with that is I'm not sure, you know, when the legislature might take action, but that's always an open question anyway. So if it's allowed, I would move to table the resolution, and then I'll follow up with Congresswoman Hooley's office and ask for a copy of that.
I'd second that.
Moved and seconded, no debate. All those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and none in opposition. It passes.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for that, everybody. Next up on our agenda is a work session update on Railroad Quiet Zone. City Manager?
Thank you, Mayor, and I'll turn over to Tom Larson. This is part of that ongoing conversation that we started a couple of months ago. Well, actually, years ago, but most recently a couple of months ago. Right.
A while back.
Thank you, Mayor. My intention today is to run quickly through a PowerPoint. Really, the high points and the factors that I considered in arriving at a recommendation that I think is very close to what we could obtain as a quiet zone, and not get into too much of the detail unless there are questions. And so I'd like to just sort of briefly go through this and then turn it back to the council. The things that we know are that the federal rules will allow us to get a quiet zone. That quiet zone will ultimately require that the railroad, state regulators, and the city, the road authority, all agree on what we're going to do at the crossings. Only routine horns would be silenced. Engineers will still use their horns in emergencies. We have been totally unable to find federal state funding, and as the local road authority, we will be responsible for the cost, both the capital costs and the operating costs of whatever things we put in place. This is the area that we've focused most of our attention on. There has been some requests to expand to, say, every crossing in the city. These crossings have the advantage that they all have real-time preemptive detection capacity. They all have existing standard gates, and some of the crossings that get mentioned in the community are Lane County crossings. They're not city crossings, so there's some jurisdictional issues. And the starting basically from an unimproved crossing and moving all the way up to a quiet zone is going to be very complicated and much more expensive. I think focusing on these crossings that are closest to the core of downtown and have the highest amount of rail traffic on them is a good place to start with a quiet zone.
All these are city.
All these are city crossings. In order to get a quiet zone, we have to install some form of supplemental safety measures. Closure is the safest one. Conversion to one-way is a way of stopping people from weaving through gates backwards, which is one of the highest risk behaviors there is at crossings. Median islands are a lower cost, fairly effective supplemental safety measure. However, generally driveways and streets in the immediate vicinity end up getting closed, and that can have a lot of impact on businesses. Quad gates allow the most flexibility in surrounding use. They also cost the most and have the highest operating cost. The state and the railroad will insist that, along with the relocation of the 8th and Hilliard crossing that supports the redevelopment of the eWeb site, that at least 2 other crossings in the general area be closed. Median islands at many sites could impact the driveway. Some businesses, it's their sole driveway, their sole access, so that factored into what supplemental safety measure we would use. There has been direction from the Secretary of Transportation that unnecessary and redundant crossings should be closed. The other thing that speaks to the desire for a quiet zone is that downtown development is held back by the noise. It's a detriment to some of our development efforts. In looking at what to pick where, I think the first thing is that we want it to be safer. The feds want it to be safer. The railroad wants it to be safer. We all agree on that. There is a theoretical, an abstract statistical concept of reducing our risk index down to below a national or our existing threshold. Once again, crossing closures where possible come in, and then trying to balance that with the impacts to businesses, the impacts to circulation, forcing people out of direction, and then looking at just the overall cost effectiveness and the total cost of what we would do. This is one of the matrices I use trying to sort through which type of supplemental safety measure we could use at each location. And this would be my recommendation, that we do quad gates at 8th and Hilliard, 5th and High, Pearl Street. We would close Lincoln. Lawrence would support a median island without serious business impacts. Washington and Jefferson, we would extend the existing one-way couplet that's south of 6th to the north across the tracks. Madison would be closed. Monroe and Van Buren would get quad gates. And here's sort of a picture of what it would look like. The 2 red dots are the ones that we closed. Federal Rail Administration has told me point blank that I will lose any argument with them that 6 crossings in 6 blocks, some of those must be redundant, some of them must be unnecessary. So the 2 crossings that are closed are adjacent to streets that remain open. Quad gates in the median are shown there. That's how I get here.
Do you have a, thank you for that very much. Do you have a list of the other crossings that people were interested in us adding to the list that we have anything to say about?
I don't have a list. There is a citizen who says there's actually 20 crossings in town, not the 10 here. I actually think there's 32. I don't know which ones he actually counted, and I believe some of the ones that he counted were county crossings, and some of them, if you go out into the industrial area west of town, there's a lot of crossings that really aren't on people's radar. They're not used very often. There's not a lot of, could be 1 or 2 trains a week, and they don't have the signaling. They don't have the advanced detection for trains. They have very low-speed trains and very infrequent trains.
I would just appreciate a little bit more information on that, too.
I can put together a list of all of the crossings and forward it to council that are on city streets, yes.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Councilor Clark, and then Councilor Brown.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, sir, for the presentation. Appreciate that. 2 big things jump to mind. One, to take off on what the mayor said, I've had an awful lot of people ask me the question, well, yeah, if the horns are a problem and in need of a quiet zone for people who live in the downtown area, which is true, what makes it a lesser need in the Train Song area or in the Bethel and Danebo area. And I have to say, I don't have a good answer for that. It seems like it's just as important out there as it is here. And I guess I'm kind of hearing from you, we should start this first and my question for clarification is that based on affordability? What's the reasoning for not doing the whole thing?
I think it's in one case affordability, in the other case return on investment. So we have crossings on Seneca and Garfield that don't even have detection for trains yet. They don't even have any gates at all. They just have a yield sign. At one point in time, I was told that the detection mechanism that they put in for trains is about $1 million per intersection. So these lesser intersections that might be getting 2 trains a day as opposed to 24, 23 trains a day, the 10 crossings that we're focused on are the main line. We do have the biggest trains, the longest trains, and again, the railroad doesn't like to give out the numbers, but I'd say 22, 23 trains a day. The disruption to people's lives for 2 trains a day and a very high entry cost, I think makes, in my mind, that's a secondary, it's phase 2.
Okay, I was just re-looking at the motion here, and it seems like we're giving, if we make and pass this motion, we're giving some fairly direct advice or direction to staff to begin to do this and to begin to pursue it. I haven't heard any city budget issues as a part of this yet, or will we later in the CIP, or can you give me any information in that regard?
I think the last line in the proposed motion is to direct staff to look for funding. So there is no identified funding at this point in time. Since I think we were last at council in 2008, staff has been looking for federal or state funding and have come up empty. There is I guess, a number of strategies that could be used, have been used. City of Salem, for example, used their pavement bond measure and had an earmark for quiet zone. There are other jurisdictions that have founded a downtown taxing district where the business owners who wanted the train horns quiet set up their own district and paid for it that way. We do have some major developments coming up, the e-website development and some development on 6th Street where we could have a willing partner for some of the development costs, but those are all unknowns.
I absolutely support the idea. I've heard from enough people to know that, but I also support it out in West Eugene, and I don't want to see them left behind because it's less affordable or because they get a few fewer trains in the course of a day. I think their need is equal in the sense of it being a disturbance in their world. And so while this, as I've reread it, gives you direction to begin to pursue, it doesn't say do it no matter what. So it gets you further down the road to bringing us, I am sure, further detail, and I can support that. The other piece, though, is with the two roads that you're suggesting close, especially in Lincoln. As near as I understand it, that's at about 2nd and Lincoln. Is that what I saw?
It's between 3rd and 4th. If 4th actually existed there.
Some friends of mine used to own a business down there, and they don't anymore. Friends of a lot of folks. The Kokies used to own QSL Printing right there. That's no longer in that same old historic building. But one of the issues I used to hear from them about all the time was that in order to fill that business adequately in our downtown area with employees, they had to park on the other side of the railroad tracks in the lots that are located there with Diamond and others. So if we're closing this, are we making the street then not passable across those tracks? Is that correct?
The street would not be passable to vehicles, bicycles, and pedestrians. We would put a fence across the end of the road.
So we will essentially be making that business and the structure, I don't actually know what's in there today, would certainly employ an awful lot of folks that would no longer be able to park in that space, if I have that right.
I believe that would be true if we close that. One of the reasons, there's several reasons for closing Lincoln. One is the way that the rest of the street network supports it. In the long-range city plan, our goal is to increase passenger rail, and one of the vital pieces of our ability to do that is adding a siding to the Eugene station. That siding will mean that we'll have to site a switch very close to Lincoln Street, and Lincoln Street will be closed in order to support that switch. So I think part of the thought process is it's probably nicer to do it now as part of a quiet zone and get that benefit as opposed to whenever we do make the improvements to passenger rail having to go through the same process.
Okay, thank you.
So I've got George and then Claire and then Alan and then George. And I did want to say that I know who's in that building now. That's where Fertilab is, and that's where it's got a architectural firm in it, and it's totally full right now of many businesses right now. So they will certainly need to be part of the consideration of what we do. Okay, Councilor Brown.
Looking this over, I just kind of started adding up the cost on the basis of what I read in the AIS, and the quad gates evidently is about $1 million per.
That would be the standard for a quad gate, but the quad gate here on 8th and Hilliard that supports the eWebsite, that's a relocation.
2.4.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
That was where I was going.
Yeah, but the quad gate.
The other
yes,
ones.
The one at Hilliard is more complicated. It's
Much more complicated.
And that really is the only one where there is potentially some identified funding. Would be if the Riverfront Urban Renewal District could support that in part anyway, and maybe even the whole thing. But is it important that it seems to me like this is the type of thing where it all has to be done at once. I mean, as a unified project. In other words, you can't say, well, let's just pick two of them because that's all we can afford.
Yes, because if we just pick two of them, the next one over, the train would still be sounding the horn in about the same place. Yeah. The federal rules do say that signals within a half a mile of each other need to be continuous in the same quiet zone. And interestingly enough, if Lincoln is closed, the distance between Pearl and Lawrence, if you take Lincoln out of the equation, is about 0.47 miles. So even those two are close enough that they would be in the same, have to be in the same district. So it doesn't break it out as we could phase the eastern 3 versus the western 7.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I get about, just adding them up roughly, I get about $6.4 million for the quad gates and including the Hilliard work. And then, the other associated costs to build the median on the one and then close two of the other ones and then changing the other ones to one way. And then I imagine is the city responsible for maintenance costs?
The city would be responsible for maintenance costs. Street closure is going to be minor fence repairs. Quad gates, the railroad will currently charge the road authority $9,000 a year each per quad gate.
For each quad gate. Okay. And ODOT would pay for those?
The road authority, the city would pay the maintenance cost.
All right. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to support the motion. I think it should move forward for more study. However, I do take the concerns of we got, been getting emails from Train Song, Bethel, Santa Clara, and River Road, people in the community organizations there, and I think their concerns are just as valid as anything here, although there's no big developments planned for those areas, but people live there. and so if people are going to live here, they do live here, and more people are going to live here. So I think their concerns are just as important and valid as anyone in proximity to these crossings. And so and you've told us that I have a list. I wrote out a list of all their. I won't go through the whole list now, but I think it would be helpful for us next time we look at this, to have this main line continued.
Right.
Some of these crossings are not on the main line, but I think that some of them are.
Oh, and I think the ones
Because it
that
goes through Trainsong.
the ones that would impact Trainsong are the crossing on Roosevelt and the crossing on Bethel, and they aren't here. They do have a significantly lower number of trains, but when you're talking about Irving and Irvington, that's the UP main line. It's got the same trains on it, exactly the same trains. Irving is a county crossing. It's not a city road there.
See.
So there is the jurisdictional issue there.
Irvington, there's two. There's Irvington Drive and Irvington Road.
And
those are at grade, and they're
I believe both. I'm sure Irving is, and I believe Irvington is.
I think. Well, I think
At least in the current urban transition.
I think it'd be helpful for us to see the whole picture if you could have a map that extended out and showed the other lines, the Coos Bay line and the Central Oregon and Pacific, because they have gated or ungated crossings
Another
for
round.
both of those. Yes, maybe.
Claire first and then Alan.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom, very much. I'm really glad to hear the support for this from my fellow councilors who've spoken so far. And I'm happy to be part of restarting this conversation from 2007. The quiet zone's impact on residents is my main reason for bringing this forward and hoping that we pass this. But just for some extra information, I've heard from folks at Travel Lane County and local hotel and B&B operators who say that the main complaint they get about when they're located in that vicinity about their stay is the train horn. So it does really have an impact on economics as well as residents' health and quality of life. So those are other things to consider. So I appreciate the questions about the other tracks, crossings outside of the downtown, and I appreciate some of the reasonings around that. I, too, would like to see more analysis of those other crossings, but I don't want to hold up what we're talking about today while we wait for that additional information. I'm curious, if the county was inclined to do improvements at Irving, could we initiate a joint quiet zone if we decided to do more crossings out of the downtown area?
I don't know.
Okay. Well, there's a question for you. And then I'm wondering, Councilor Brown brought up the urban renewal funds to deal with the crossing at 8th and Hilliard. In theory, could we use those urban renewal funds to pay for that entire crossing and the ongoing maintenance?
The maintenance, I don't believe so. The capital part, the improvement, the actual railroad crossing, as well as there's road work that would have to be done as well, those urban renewal dollars could be used for that entire project there. But the maintenance part, urban renewal dollars are not a maintenance eligible.
And then our CIP that's going to be voted on later this evening, was I seeing correctly there was a $6 million placeholder for this project?
I believe $6 million was the number we came up with last fall. We've got a little better numbers now. So the 7.4 number is based on information we didn't have 3 or 4 months ago.
So right now, your estimate is to do what you're recommending in this scenario would be about 7.4.
That's a very early on estimate.
Understanding that sometimes construction costs can be different.
And one of the things that, as Tom mentioned, it might be that the understanding is this is the phase 1. We do some work on that, and then we come back to look at the rest of the corridor as a future phase 2. And so anticipate that will also be in the queue as we kind of move down the road. So that may be an option.
Yeah, that's great, City Manager. I really appreciate that. I think if we were successful in moving this forward and we actually created a quiet zone for downtown, the other parts of the city would want one too. And then Jefferson was one-way for many, many years. Is that correct? Didn't get switched to two-way about 8 years ago or
Oh, longer ago.
longer than that?
I believe it's been in the existing configuration for 20 years, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if it wasn't a one-way street before that.
Okay. I remember it switching at one point, but so those were all my questions. Thanks very much. I'm definitely supportive of the motion and happy to be having this more in-depth work session on this topic.
Alan.
Thanks, Tom. Good presentation. That's what we asked for. Can we get the PowerPoint from you at some point?
All 5 slides.
We didn't get one at our
There's
table.
one you haven't seen yet.
No, just the one, that one.
Depends on how the vote goes.
Yeah. I do hear about this issue quite a bit. It's often said in my part of town anyway, and I've heard about it from other folks, and I share the concern about other folks having this issue as well. I had a friend lived near a crossing, and every time I'd go to his house, it would just blow me away how noisy that was, and they weren't even in this section. So I would also like to see the full picture, at least the map of all the crossings and what the jurisdictions are, not the potential detail that we're looking at, but to see the fuller picture. I'd like to see that in the short term. This is kind of expensive, $7.4 million, but it's a good place to start with this section, I think. My questions really revolve around the funding. I know that's part of the motion is come back with funding if we pass that, but so there's no federal funding, there's no railroad funding, and there's no funding from the state, so pretty much all falls on us.
That's my understanding. We've been unable to come up with those alternatives.
Right. So that means general fund. You mentioned CDBG, which is actually federal, but what CDBG would that portion of that? Just
You're actually pushing me out of my comfort zone right there.
Okay.
I think funding and finance, I generally look to others. I don't know what the limits are on that.
Okay. And then urban renewal district, the only one that fits in the riverfront one is the 8th and Hilliard, right? High and Pearl are out of that.
I believe that High sits right on the boundary of the urban renewal.
Because originally we were talking about
that might
two.
qualify.
Arguably be in, but the 8th and Hilliard one is the only one that's...
There's a boundary right down the middle of the street or something.
Yeah, that second one, we've been taking a look at it, and it may qualify
For urban renewal.
For urban
riverfront
renewal.
urban renewal.
Beyond that, the Pearl,
Clearly.
yeah, definitely not.
Okay, so that would be helpful. Then I guess, we're not going to find general fund money for this. I don't see that in my lifetime. So that kind of puts us into a levy, which would be, in my mind, a good way to probably do that would be the next road bond, which is kind of what Salem did, correct? They put it in their...
It was exactly an identified project, like our list of identified projects.
So we
in
just
road
tack
bond.
on an extra several $1 million to the bond to have that funded.
Perhaps
And,
simplistically, yes.
When is the next road bond? When is this one we just passed?
Started.
So it's got 4 more years on it, I think.
No, I don't
Anybody-
2016, 2017.
That's when it comes up?
Yeah.
26, the end of 16.
12, so it would come up in 17.
Passed it in 12, okay. So yeah, 17 would be the next one. So we'd vote on it in 16. So that's not too far away, actually. It's closer than I thought. I guess one of the other things I'd like to know more about when we look at this, and I'll support the motion too, is the impacts on Lincoln and Madison. Looking at the map, I could clearly see where the parking lot is, and it would force people to walk another whole block and come around instead of just the real quick one. So it's not a devastating blow, but it is an inconvenience. And those are always those kind of trade-offs. I'm not sure how it would impact the business, but the closure of Lincoln and Madison are the two biggies on there. So I think focusing on the impacts of those and maybe learning from MX that we should go talk to
Want
people
another
in
round,
that
Evan?
immediate area would be the last thing I would want to say. No.
And what I would say in that is part of the entire project would be connecting with property owners and businesses and all of those kinds of things. Closing a crossing is not without its energy. And so or is putting one way or two ways in. And so that's all part of what we would be doing as part of the project, is to touch bases with all those affected interests and talk about mitigation and impacts and all of those kinds of things.
Okay. In the study.
As part of moving forward with a total project.
And that actually would get to the slide that I hadn't shown, which would be making perhaps the rash assumption that the motion passed, what the next steps would be.
George Poling.
Thank you. Yeah, Claire, at one time, both Washington and Jefferson were one-way streets. So
Yeah.
that
That's my memory.
is it's going back a few years. There's been some concerns raised about the closing of some of the crossings, the economic impact, both positive and negative. But I'm glad, John, that you mentioned you'll be contact with the property owners and the businesses. But there's one part of the conversation that I haven't heard, and leave it to me to bring it up, and that's involving the fire department, EMS, and also the police department in this conversation because of response times and rerouting and everything else that's involved. So when we do have this discussion, I hope we have the input from them. I'm all for the quiet zone. It's just how we're going to get there. And, it's like this conversation was put on a hiatus since 2007, and we're just picking up from where we left off. So, I do have some real concerns about the closing the crossings and also the median islands, because they're going to impact the property, both residential and business. So we do need to involve them in that. But, I've been hearing from a lot of folks that I think, like Mike was saying, that it's going to impact their current and future businesses, how this goes. So we need to move forward. It's just how we're going to get there.
So a couple things that I wanted to bring up, and then I've got in a queue Mike and George and Claire, is one, when we were in Washington for the United Front, heard about rail in general, that their only interest is in money for capital projects, not for ongoing running. So there may be a window there somewhere for this. And the other thing I want to say is that on our Envision Eugene discussion, we are talking about an environmental justice overlay, and in some places here we have environmental justice issues in some of the neighborhoods in West Eugene around rail, and so this is an opportunity to take that into consideration. And I also think this is a big enough deal that we probably ought to kind of look at it through the TBL window and really look at it from the impact on social equity and the impact on jobs and the impact on the environment. All of those things we should be probably taking a good strong look at. And the only other thing that comes to my mind about this one is this is a really good question. We've heard, and I've heard a lot from people in the community about their desire to do something about this. And most of it's not about the development. It's really about impact on their daily lives. And so if we're going to have this discussion, it really has to center a great deal around livability for people in the community. And then the next question is, what are they willing to put up to make it so? And I think that's a very good question to have with the community. We want to do this. Resources are what they are. So are we willing to all say this is important enough for our community to chip some dollars into to do it? And whether it's joined with a road bond or as a separate issue, I don't know. But I do think this is one of those that's big enough that kind of community engagement and asking those questions is really important. Okay, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. If we do end up with a local component for capital investment on this and have to figure out how to pay for this locally, I think Alan's, what he mentioned is an interesting idea. I think that's certainly one we should talk about whether or not it's a good idea to put this on a road bond. That's a critical piece of work we've been doing and will continue to do and has succeeded. And I don't think that I'd want to put anything on it that would imperil it in any way from its current level of support. And I think it might be wiser for us to look at a broader window of affected citizens if we're going to ask the entire community to vote on this. I think we might see greater success that way. That's just a kind of an electoral thought on that. The other piece is that, as near as I understand this motion, this is a two-step process that you're in next, which is seek the federal approval for the zone and figure out how we're going to pay for it, right?
Well, I would say 3 steps because we have to negotiate the details. This is a conceptual plan, and so there's an intermediate step where we would refine the cost estimates, and we might change what we're doing at one of these intersections, say, as we're negotiating with the railroad and the state.
I will offer an amendment when the motion gets made to change a word or two in here, because I believe as long as you're at the process of creating federal approval for a quiet zone, we ought to have that zone be as large and wide as is our desire for it to ultimately be. And at some point we may have to phase in the actual work based on affordability. But as long as we're asking for approval, I wonder if we might not ask for the whole pie up front. So I'll have a motion to address that, because I think that the folks in West Eugene deserve to have a quiet zone as much as the ones downtown. So why not say, when we're asking for permission, ask for all, and then pay for it as we can.
George Brown?
I'll pass, Mayor.
Claire?
So I just had a little input on the previous round. I'm not the expert on the CDGB funding, but when Stephanie Jennings was here presenting on the consolidated plan, she mentioned that those funds can be used to fund improvements in low-income neighborhoods, and I connected that to the idea of maybe purposing some of those funds for the Quiet Zone project if it was within the neighborhood that qualified under CDGB. But I don't know if we'd want to reallocate those funds, because they generally are pretty much designated for things we know we want to spend them on already. So, but maybe future iterations that might work. And then to the Lincoln Street building where QSL used to be, it is full of new activity right now, and so it's true there could definitely be some impact on where they park, and they might have to find new parking strategies, but at the same time they might appreciate the increased ability to have uninterrupted conversations and keep their concentration throughout the day. It'd definitely be important to hear from them, but so those are the kinds of trade-offs that we're considering, and I think it's a good conversation, an important one to have, and so I just want to add those two pieces.
Alan?
Yeah, so if we knocked off 2.4 million and then maybe another million, so that'd be $3.5 million out of the urban renewals, then we're at about $4 million. That's probably too small to do its own levy, because it would be not cost effective. The cost of doing it would be so high that it wouldn't be a smart cost.
We wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah, it would be so expensive to do it that way. So tacking it on to something larger makes it more cost effective to do.
Got it.
Okay.
Okay. So we're going to put the motion on the table?
I move that council direct staff to pursue a downtown railroad quiet zone approval with the Federal Railroad Administration using one-way streets and cross enclosures as alternate supplemental safety measures as needed, and direct staff to pursue sources of local funding.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Councilor Clark?
I would move to amend to remove the word downtown and add the word Eugene, thus giving us the opportunity to have a future discussion that's wider in possibility.
I would accept that amendment.
I will too.
Okay. George?
Yes, ma'am. Just two real quick things. The vote we're doing is just getting approval from the railroad to move forward, and not actually build, or we're just getting their approval to start the basic work. So this vote does not equal actual building. And then the only concern I have is the wording of the using crossing closures. I'm not real excited about that. So if there was some understanding or maybe another word inserted
But
as
possibly using.
possible use of, I would be
Is that
okay with
okay?
that.
You guys are,
Sure, it's the city manager.
yeah.
I think that's okay, but I think with the understanding that from the railroad perspective, the federal government perspective, that closures would be not having any closures through this would be probably a rare exception. So so I wouldn't want to leave the expectation that there would probably be no closures through the corridor as part of a project that actually is able to go forward. We can say possible closures. Maybe that makes it feel a little bit better, but I just wouldn't want to leave the expectation that closures are off the table, because there will be an expectation from others around that.
And I don't want it in there to make it sound like that we're going to absolutely use the closures, because without the input from the people that live, that will be affected by either the closures or the median strips, as well as the public safety factor, I'm not willing to support it. So
what if
And we're fine with the word possible,
Okay.
and that's fine. And then just one other thing on the full corridor, I don't disagree with that. I think it would be a good thing to do. It doubles or triples the amount of energy that goes into the look at all of that. So what I would suggest is if we pass that, and then as we get into it, it may be that the phasing just isn't at the financial part, but there may be a phasing of the detailed work as well after we've done some initial work. And so we could bring that back to council to see how that works.
And if I might add, I think the recommendation we're making today is based on a lot of work that we did with the railroad and with ODOT PUC in 2005 through 2008. If we're going to start expanding to 10 or 12 crossings further north and 10 or 12 crossings further west, we're going to have to do all of that background work, and I think it would really stretch out the identifying a project and what we're going to do at individual crossings.
So that really gives me pause, because I know that some of the things that we were told back in 2008 are no longer the same.
Well, some of those things are no longer the same. Van Buren is an interesting example, because as we're doing this analysis right now, a median island would close the sole access to a business that wasn't there in 2008 when we were looking at it.
Federal government has changed some of its policies around this, and I think you really need to look at what the policy changes that have happened since.
And all I'm saying is, no disagreement that we should look at the whole corridor. I think not knowing what the full extent of the work is for that entire corridor, we may want to phase parts of that work in addition to the financial piece. We will know more as we look into it. We can come back and let you know that, and then you can decide how you want to phase that or not. But it just feels like there may be another phase in there that would be helpful, and so the whole project isn't on hold for another multiple years.
Alan and Mike.
Yeah, that was my concern, was that making it be the entire city may delay this a whole another year or something like that, when we have this opportunity to move forward with just this part and work on in parallel the other parts of it. I think if we have the intent that we want to look at the entire corridor, but we'll do it in chunks and we'll keep working towards getting it done, I wouldn't want to hold up this whole process another whole year or so, probably, and all the work that we've done to almost start over and include all those other ones. We can move that forward and then start that as a parallel process. That's if that's my understanding of the way that we would interpret that, then I could support this. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't.
Okay, George?
No,
Mike and then George.
In an odd turn of events, I disagree slightly with my friend. I would say, if you can perhaps bring us back a scope of work and say, looking at it, in its entirety, will take this long to get back to you. Look, and this part of this will take this length of time, would be, I think, a worthwhile way to interpret the vote based on the motion as it is, and we can make a different decision to break up the zone approval process if it warrants it. But to proceed with it as one, as it is, I would say that when we get around to the funding portions of it, when we get around to some of the details, we're going to want to, I think we're going to want to consider the whole for making it easier for the community to buy into rather than just a part. That's going to create dissension by its nature. If these guys get one, but these guys don't. And I think we should try to compress the conversation as much as we can until we absolutely physically can't.
Thanks, Mayor. Well, yes, I agree with Councilor Clark on that. I think it's real important to have an equitable process here. It's my understanding from what I've heard so far, there's not that many city responsibility crossings on the main line north of here. Is that correct?
There would be Irving and Irvington.
Right, so there's only two. So we're not really expanding the scope of what the motion says that much. We want to see that in there and possibly a solution for those. And then I believe that we requested to see just a simple map of
a map
the
of
other
all
lines. And those evidently are not the city's responsibility, but it would be nice to see that anyway. It would be nice for the neighbors because then they would go, okay, let's go to the county for these crossings and lobby them to do something about it.
Well, and I think the other thing we can add is the railroad that has jurisdiction. That might make a nice division that we work with one railroad at a time as opposed to a neighborhood at a time that might have two railroads involved in their crossing.
Right.
So just for clarification, because it feels like we're talking about several different things. If we're talking about the main line is what you're talking about, Mike, that feels different than 32 total crossings which are on other lines and in other directions. And so when we talk about a Eugene Railroad quiet zone, maybe we just need to make sure we understand what portion we're talking about.
From my perspective, when I made that word change, I meant the whole community, every place
Not
that
just the main
affects
line.
everything that affects a Eugene residential neighborhood.
Got it.
32.
Predominantly. Yeah, well, from the standpoint of, I don't know how long it would take to ask the feds, can we create a quiet zone for all of this versus just this? And so, I'd like to see us do it for all. If you have to come back to us and say, well, that's going to delay it for a year and a half. Well, okay, well then let's talk about this differently so that we don't leave out part of our community.
We have to transition into our next work session, but I did want to say this, that I think there is a substantial difference between the impact of 23 trains going through a neighborhood a day and one or two. There is an enormous difference in that. So that's one thing. And the other thing I think is that when we do this, I would like to think that we look out and say, here's where we'd like to arrive eventually. Mm-hmm. And that's clear. You may have to phase it in, as you say, over time, and as money allows you to do it. But one of the things I've learned in this job is if you don't know where you're going, you're probably not going to get there. So I just think it's really,
Anywhere.
I think it's really important for us to be very focused on where it is we want to end up, and then you can figure out how to go about doing it.
Can I just make sure I get clarification on if the motion passes? And again, we're fine with including the whole thing, but what I would suggest is we would go back and do some more detailed work. We would come back here and probably have another conversation about phasing before we go too far into the technical analysis. And then there might be some decisions around that move us another step. So, and I don't know how long that could take. That could take weeks, months. I'm not sure. I'll talk to Tom, but we'll come back with another conversation around other parts of that.
Okay.
I was just going to say, Manager, I think you've got that right about how we should proceed from a council perspective. But I wanted to change the motion because I want it to be really clear to the community what our vision of the project is, and that's to change it for everybody that we possibly can.
Okay, we're going to vote now. All those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It passes. Thank you. All right.
Tom?
Conversation number 1. Phase, whatever it is.
In the conversation.
He's 18.
Next, and the other part of this is the timing has to fit in with actual timing of when development takes place.
That's part of what we will want to come back
Right.
and have a whole conversation around several different pieces. So
All right, Central Lane scenario planning update.
I'll just turn over to Rob and his team.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Council. I'm Robin Hostic, Acting Planning Director for Eugene. With me today is Kristen Hull of CH2M Hill. She's our lead consultant and also the project manager for the Central Lane Scenario Planning Project. We're going to tag team the presentation a little bit. Kristen will do most of it, but I'll give you a bit of an intro. So, looks like we're queued up. We last updated council on this topic back in September of 2014, and today's work session is also an update just to kind of catch you up, so we're not asking for any action today. As a brief recap, what is scenario planning? Well, a few years ago, the state legislature asked our region to take a look at some what-if scenarios that centered around the question of what could the region do to achieve the state's greenhouse gas emission reduction target. In our region, so that's Lane County, Springfield, Coburg, Eugene, we looked at what's likely to happen under current policies moving forward and what are some of the other policies and strategies that we might look at to achieve this state goal, and some analysis to help us understand what the outcome might be if we were to pursue those alternatives. So the process looked at some outcomes, not just in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but also what the effects might be from a triple bottom line perspective. So really broadening the lens that we use to look at that to include the local economy, public health, social equity, those kinds of things. And this is really important to keep in mind because this is a what-if exercise. It doesn't require any of the partners to act or implement any of the alternatives. So it's truly a learning exercise, both for the regional partners and for the state, to understand what it would take to achieve these goals. So from that perspective, it's actually been really helpful to have the state provide funding for us to do that. And I'll let Kristen share the punchline, but one of the messages we'll be sending back to the state around feasibility is that the region is going to need some help to make this lift. To meet the reduction goal, and also a lot of the other co-benefits that go along with that. So where are we in the process? There's 3 steps outlined up here. Basically starting with looking at the existing policies to give us some kind of a clear baseline and figure out how we're going to evaluate the possible changes. And then after that, in step 2, we did some work developing, comparing, and evaluating alternatives. And we reported back on steps 1 and 2 back in September. Since then, we've been doing a lot of work on step 3. So we're back here presenting to you what that refined preferred scenario looks like. And the final step in the process, and which is your job as decision makers and is required by the state, is to identify at least one scenario for how the region could meet the state's greenhouse gas emission reduction target and to cooperatively select that. And I think what that's going to look like is basically having the mayor sign a letter along, and I think all the other jurisdictions are going to do the same thing. And then the team would forward that on up to the state before the end of the 2015 legislative session. So that's the requirements that we get that information back there. So right now, our main goal in March and April is to make sure that all the different jurisdictions have a chance to take a look at the preferred scenario and get an update on that, and we can hear back from them. And then after that, we'll come back around to have this, to probably do some kind of a motion to have the mayor sign that. So again, it never hurts to repeat that we're not required to implement that. This really is a learning process. But in Eugene, because we've adopted the climate recovery ordinance, this has special meaning. So we're going to have to figure that out sooner or later. And this information is actually really helpful, and it gives us a set of tools to help us understand what happens when we turn those various dials. But again, the effort doesn't require us to do that. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Kristen, along with microphone.
I have the clicker as well. Thank you. So I want to take a second and recognize Josh from LCOG, who's here today. And Josh has been the technical lead on the project and is really the expert at turning the crank on the model and understand all the details of the policy choices. So we have done some community outreach since we saw you last. We put together an online tool that allowed the public to build their own scenarios by determining which actions they'd want to invest in and seeing the outcomes, both in terms of greenhouse gases and the co-benefits Robin talked about. We had about 100 people go to our website. So pretty good response, and heard back that people thought that active transportation, transit, were really popular. The ways they might pay for it were a little bit less popular with folks, which is not surprising. And we also did a telephone survey. The outreach results for the telephone survey were very, very similar to what we heard through the public outreach, which is people like the idea of investing in transit. They like the idea of investing in active transportation. They're much more concerned about how we actually pay for those things. So it's not surprising to any of you, I don't think, that we like this stuff, but it's really hard. So I've been over this stuff with you a couple of times before, so I'm going to fly through this, and you can ask me questions if you have them. State did assign a 20% reduction goal to this region, along with goals for the other MPOs in the state. You're not required to meet that target, but you're required to consider it. And we've met that requirement at this point. We have considered a scenario that meets the 20% reduction target, so that piece we're done with. We talked about that at your last meeting. Just the takeaway here is the CRO is a little more aggressive, likely, than the state's target, and they're using different base years and different measures, and it's fossil fuel. So, but big picture, it's a little more aggressive. So you're going to need to do everything in the preferred, or one way to accomplish the CRO would be to do everything in the preferred scenario and then some, based on our analysis at this point. So again, we've been over this before. 2035, we used that as a base. We looked at Envision Eugene as part of that base case. We think there'd be about 64,000 new people in the region based on the estimates given to us by the state. That's an input that we don't have any control over, but that's where we started. We looked at 3 alternative scenarios: the reference scenario, one where we'd enhance existing policy, and one where we push things a little further and explore some new policies. And not surprisingly, our preferred scenario is a hybrid of those 3 scenarios. So we did look at, we looked at those, basically as you moved up the ladder, you worked harder, you got more benefits. And the benefits were in terms of greenhouse gas reduction, but also in terms of economy and public health. They all kind of increased together. They moved the same direction. I'm going to skip over that piece. So the recommended preferred scenario really looks at a couple of things. We recommend looking at roadway optimization, fleet and fuels, which is some assumptions given to us by the state, and parking, really sticking with existing policy. We look at making a bigger investment or a bigger change in fees and taxes related to driving. So that means looking at some new ways to charge more drivers for their use of the roads. And then making a bigger investment in education and marketing programs, active transportation, and transit. I'll talk about those things in some more detail as I go. So just to step back for just a second, what the preferred scenario means, it provides information to local governments about what might happen if certain outcomes occur. So what do we get for it? It's not regulatory, and it's meant to be very flexible. So just to remind you that our preferred scenario really is a balanced approach. We look at lots of different levers. The little bars there give you an idea of how hard we're pushing on each lever. So transit, active transportation, pricing, education, marketing are the big lifters here. Fleet and fuels, parking management, and roads are much lighter hits. Would you like me to go into the details of the preferred scenario in terms of what the inputs are? Is that useful? Okay. So roadways, looking at existing plans, the local plans in your region are already very robust in how we manage and optimize our existing roadways. I'm sure you've had lots of conversations about that over the years, about how we make the most of our system that we have. So this looks at things like ramp metering and managing access to roadways. So there's not a lot more progress to be made in this area. Fleet and fuel assumptions. This is about how the technology of what we drive looks like. And the state has suggested to us some reasonable assumptions that they think are reasonable, and we chose to use those assumptions that the state articulated through the target rule. We think about parking. We're really thinking about investing in your existing plans in this area. A couple of small changes. It seems like it might be a good idea to allow developers greater flexibility in how they provide parking. That might be a strategy you'd want to consider. You also might want to consider a strategy in the future that allows the fees for long-term parking, particularly in Eugene, to increase as the market will allow. So that's something that, we're assuming basically the existing policies, but those are some strategies that might be helpful in meeting your goals. Taxes and fees related to driving. We're recommending investing beyond existing plans in this area. This graph shows the kinds of decline we're expecting to see in gas tax revenue. This is probably not surprising to you because ODOT's been talking about this a lot in terms of how, as fuel efficiency of our vehicle fleet increases, our gas tax revenues are going to decrease unless we do something different. So we're recommending a bigger investment in this area, or a bigger change in this area, which could mean increasing the gas tax, or it could mean moving to some other sort of fee related to driving. But because the base case actually shows a diminishing amount of gas tax revenue. So it's kind of important to remember that the base case is actually a decrease over time. So I'm going to talk about that. Transit, we're recommending an expansion or investment beyond existing plans. So some key strategies here would be doing things that would allow us to increase the transit service in our community. So finding a stable source of funding for capital improvements and operations and maintenance, encouraging new development along those frequent transit network corridors, supporting increased surface frequencies. Some of these things are things you can do. Some are written as support because we need you to support LTD in making these kinds of changes, but those kinds of investments. Active transportation, we're looking at increasing biking and walking for 3 to 5 times today's rates in all cities. So major increases in biking and walking, even more than is in your bicycle and pedestrian, or pedestrian and bicycle master plan. So this means capital stuff like building biking and walking facilities. It also means other changes that encourage people to use those facilities. So maybe a bike share program, expanding safe routes to schools, really making it easier and more attractive to use those great facilities that we would build. Education and marketing, these are the ways we try to influence people's behavior and helping people know that there are options out there. So these are relatively low cost to implement. They have a relatively small impact on their own, but they help to magnify the impacts of the other things we might do. So if you have a great transit system and you have a great biking and walking system, it doesn't work if nobody knows it's out there. So these are ways we encourage people to make those changes, and that's either by providing information, doing things like commute reduction programs, maybe expanding car sharing in the region. So if you don't drive to work, you have access to a vehicle during the day. There are lots of ways we can do this, but these are those other things, the soft stuff. So if we implement the preferred scenario, I already told you the punchline, which is we get improvements in economy. In the economy, we get improvements in public health, in equity, and this reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So I'll show you a few of the findings from this, and you have a handout in your packet that shows some numbers associated with different measures we looked at. So we know that driving costs are relatively stable as a percentage of income, so that's good. So even if we make these changes, we aren't going to increase the cost to drive on a household basis. We also would reduce congestion and delay on the vehicle system. These kinds of changes, we actually have a benefit to congestion and delay, particularly freight delay. Health benefits, we reduce healthcare spending. We see fewer premature deaths because more people are using active modes to get around, so we're healthier. So those are some of the benefits on that side. equity is an important piece of the triple bottom line. The equity strategies, equity will really need to be monitored as the strategies are implemented over time, because they have a lot to do with where improvements are made, who programs are provided to. And so at this very high policy level, it's hard to get at the details. But we do know that that driving costs are not increased for households in the region. So that's important to recognize. But other than that, we found really equity was about outreach for this process and was a hard thing to quantify. We do get to our greenhouse gas emission target that the state set in this process. And remember that the CRO goes a little farther than this. So our next step is to come back to you with this letter that Robin described later this spring. Other than that, I think we're about done with this process, depending on what I hear from you and the other elected officials over the course of the next couple of weeks.
Councillor Clark?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you very much for that presentation. Appreciate it. Slide number 9. You mentioned that the population projection for the next 20 years is a fixed number that we received elsewhere. Can you tell me where that came from, please?
Can I talk about that?
Yeah, give it a shot. I believe, well, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but okay. So yeah, this is the same population number we've been using for our growth planning, which I believe is the 2008 PSU forecast.
That's where that came from.
Yeah.
So am I to understand that if I took what that forecast predicted for Eugene, Springfield, and Coburg, that's where the 64,000 number comes from?
Josh just said yes.
Yes, that's correct.
So Eugene's is 34,000, and when you add Springfield and Coburg, you get 30,000 growth in the next 20 years. Am I really seeing that correctly?
I suppose if you did the math and you just subtracted out Eugene's portion, that would be, everything else would have to be outside of Eugene. Yeah.
That doesn't ring true for me, so I'm having a little bit of an issue here. I'd love to have some clarification on, so is it, if you could you please get me print copies where you developed those numbers from specifically, because I'd like to learn a little bit more about that.
Yep,
Appreciate
we'll follow
it.
up.
Or perhaps you can tell me, if you know off the top of your head, what the Eugene specific number is. Is the Eugene's 34,000?
Yeah, Eugene population forecast is forecast to increase by 34,000 people over the next 20 years from that point on.
And so Springfield is, I mean, Coburg is a very small place with 1,000 people in it. So what we're saying here is that we expect in the next 20 years Springfield to grow roughly the same amount as Eugene?
Well, since it's a 2008 forecast, we actually do have some information since then to kind of track how accurate that forecast has been since that time. So
I'm not trying to be argumentative with you, brother. I'm just if we're doing this work, I want to understand the basis on which it's stacked.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is correct. And from what I understand, the forecast is actually fairly close to what the actual numbers have been in the larger communities, and smaller communities have actually grown a little bit less.
Do you have any information on what date specifically we might expect a revised piece of information from PSU or other official sources?
We'll have a draft forecast coming out from PSU, I believe, here pretty soon, maybe in the next week or two even. And then after that, there's going to be a period of like a comment period. So I believe sometime in, is it late March or April? Don't quote me on either one of those, but fairly soon, that's the earliest that it could be official. And after that, the new forecast, I think, is legally required to be finalized by June 15th.
Well, I have to say, I don't want to take up too much time on this, but one of the things we talked about the other day in our Envision Eugene work was making sure that we had the best and most accurate facts and figures and information and making changes based on those numbers. So I would look forward to seeing what those numbers are, as we'll probably have them in time to have such consideration. Thank you.
Councilor Zelenka?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation, Robin and Kristen. Robin, you sure know how to clear a room, though. Great presentation and good work on the study. It's how long have you been working on this?
I think I've been working on it for about a year and a half,
Yeah.
but I think it's been going on for a year before that.
Right. We hired you partly down the road. Yeah, good work so far. Interesting to note that we get benefits in the economy, meaning costs go down, public health, meaning people's health goes up and costs go down, and we get equity, improved equity, and we also, as almost an ancillary benefit, we get greenhouse gas emission reductions, so we meet the targets. The point was to look at greenhouse gas reductions, but the way we framed this, we talked about it in terms of the co-benefits associated with that, in terms of the economy and the equity and the public health and all the things that we get in addition to greenhouse gas reductions. So what the study says is that we do get these benefits, which is interesting because this is it's a cost-benefit analysis on a bigger scale, and what we're seeing is that if we make these changes, our community is going to be better off by doing this on not in just one area, greenhouse gas emissions, but on the economic issues, on public health and equity issues as well. So one might ask, what's the cost of doing nothing? Well, it actually will cost us more in all those areas if we do nothing. So what's interesting to me is, you went through the laundry list of all of these different kinds of changes, and they are going to change the way that we do things. They're not necessarily going to change the cost associated with them, but in some cases it'll change how people pay. For instance, pay-as-you-go driving means that you pay or insurance for that matter, how much you drive is how much you pay in terms of road costs and insurance costs, as well as gas taxes. But we've seen the graph for years about gas taxes just kind of plummeting, and as we get more hybrids and more electric vehicles, that's even going to get worse. So changing the way that we pay for things and the way that we do things is going to have a whole slew of different issues. I mean, you can imagine the social equity concerns about people who live in Eastern Oregon on a pay-as-you-drive system when the nearest store is 100 miles away makes a big difference. And people who are for a living do transportation things. But again, about 40% of the greenhouse gases comes from transportation, about 40% from electricity. So how we deal with the transportation stuff in this scenario is really important to getting towards the greenhouse gas emission controls. Robin, it's interesting that you talked just briefly about the climate recovery ordinance, and so these things go hand in glove. Can you talk a little bit about more how those two things integrate?
Well, I think you got most of it in that the climate recovery ordinance looks at greenhouse gas emissions as a whole, so across all the different sectors, not just transportation, and that this looks at just the transportation piece, and within that sector, just at light vehicles.
Right.
So that's how they interact from that standpoint.
This is a slice.
Yeah, it's just a slice. Does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mr. Brown?
Thanks, Mayor. Well, about this 64,000 new residents, I think part of the disjunction is, my understanding is Portland State University's, their population forecast went by census periods from 2010 to 2030, and that was our number for Eugene was 34,000 increase. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Whereas this forecast goes an extra 5 years, so it's an extra 20% from, the baseline information that we were presented with a few years ago.
Interrupt you for just a second.
Yeah.
Beth, it's not taking the sun out yet.
Yeah,
So we're still looking at people across here in shadows, and we're not seeing their faces at all. So that's, I think, what George was trying to do something about.
Needs turning.
I don't know what we do, but it's really bad right now. Okay, George.
Well, yeah, so I think I also, in addition to Councilor Clark, I'd just kind of like to see how, at least a reference to the study that we could look up and see how those figures were derived. It's because it is, higher than the figures that we were presented for But it was a different time period, too. It's a different planning horizon, slightly, off by 5 years, so that'd be good. And I've been looking over this information from the Northwest Economic Research Center about the carbon tax idea that's floating around in Salem, and I'm assuming that anything that the state does would preempt any local measures that the local municipalities might enact regarding vehicle miles driven and everything except perhaps a municipality
Yes, our
specific gas tax increase.
Our strategy around vehicle miles traveled tax is that local governments here would support the state's efforts to implement that, or a pay-as-you-drive insurance sort of policy, that you wouldn't implement it locally on your own, but you would support the state's efforts.
Okay. I think those are my only questions now. Thanks.
I just wanted to say that I think this is an interesting moment, and I think it's what we've been aiming for, is where the work from our livability grant, this is scenario planning, the climate and energy work, they're all, Envision Eugene, it's all kind of converging for us in terms of the direction we need to go as a community. We've been given an amazing array of tools to look at, to move in that direction right now, and we've been got funding from the state to do this work, and we've got funding from the federal government to do the the livability grant. All of that's has informed this discussion and should inform how we move forward into our future. And I think the idea was that they were giving us a toolbox, and we could take the tools out of the toolbox and try different levers and see what that did for us, and then we would figure out which ones we wanted to really put to use to get us to the end goals that we want to have. So it's been very interesting, and I appreciate the presentation today. Thank you. Anybody else have anything? Thank you very much. Yeah, we could do the consent agenda. Let's do that. Claire, you want to put that on the table?
Sure. And just to let you know, I've got to leave and miss the rest of tonight's meeting. I need to head down to Coos Bay for work, so you won't see me after 7:30. Where is the...
You want mine?
Thank you, Mayor. I move to approve the items on the consent calendar.
Second.
Well done.
Well done, Claire.
Well done.
Moved and seconded. Discussion? Okay, all those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Passes. Thank you all. We'll be back at 7:30 with Claire's on her way.
So challenging.
No challenges to your motion.